When her husband died in the fall of 1884, Merritt Holland left his wife a single folded page of notes, a shed floored with river stones he had hauled for reasons she did not know, and the instruction that the cellar beneath the kitchen must be finished and filled with salted fish before the first hard frost of the coming year. He had not said why. He had written the sentence on the last page of an old ledger in a hand already unsteady, and beneath it he had drawn a small crooked shape that might have been a map or might have been the shape of a fish or might have been nothing at all. Anna Holland was 39 years old that spring. She lived alone on a quarter section 3 miles east of the town of Bell Creek, in the high pale country of eastern Wyoming, where the wind came down from the bighorns in long unbroken sheets, and the summers were short and the winters were the kind that closed a country the way a man closes a book. She read the note the morning after the burial. She read it again the night after that. She did not weep over it. She had done her weeping already, quietly, in the barn where the cows would not carry the story back into the house. She folded the paper along its old creases and put it into the tin box where her husband had kept his few important things, a lock of hair from a child who had not lived, a pocket watch that no longer ran, a receipt for a plow he had never finished paying for. She set the tin on the shelf above the stove, and she went out to look at the shed. The shed stood 20 paces from the kitchen door. Merritt had begun it the summer before he took sick. He had dug a pit beneath it deeper than any root cellar in the county, and had lined the floor with river stones the size of a man's fist, laid tight and level, and he had built the walls of the shed above it out of double-thick planks with a strange packing of dry moss and clay between them. She had asked him once what he was doing. He had said it would keep. He had not said what would keep. She had thought at the time that he meant potatoes. She had thought a great many things at the time that turned out to be only half true. Now, in the pale April light, she stood at the edge of the pit and looked down at the stones. There was no ladder yet. The walls were only half-board. The roof was on, but the door was not hung. A great deal of work remained, and she was one woman alone, and the growing season was already pressing at her back like a hand between the shoulder blades. She climbed down into the pit using the low places in the stone as footholds. The air at the bottom was cool. Not cold, not damp, only cool, in the way a spring house is cool. She laid her palm on the stone and felt no chill of standing water. She stood there for a long time. She did not know why the stones were laid that way. She only knew that her husband had laid them, and that he had told her the work must be finished, and that he had not been a man who wasted a summer on a shed for potatoes. She climbed out, and she began. Word traveled in Bell Creek the way it travels in any small town, carried on the same wind that carried everything else, and delivered to the porches of the same 3 or 4 houses that considered themselves the arbiters of what was worth knowing. By the middle of May, it was generally understood that the Holland widow had refused her brother-in-law's offer to buy the quarter section, that she had refused the preacher's suggestion that she return east to her people in Ohio, and that she had, for reasons no one could account for, begun to salt fish. It was the fish that struck them hardest. A woman alone might reasonably keep chickens. A woman alone might, at a stretch, keep a milk cow and a garden and make some hard shift of a living. But fish, in a country 3 days' ride from any water that ran cold enough and steady enough to hold trout in summer, was a thing that had to be sought. And Anna Holland sought it. She hitched the wagon herself and drove north to the forks of the Belle Fourche in the last week of May, and she came back 4 days later with barrels. Actual barrels, 6 of them, oak and iron banded, and inside the barrels, packed in coarse salt she had bought on credit at Enderby's store, were more fish than any single household in Bell Creek had eaten in a year. Cordelia Enderby, whose husband kept the store, was the first to say it out loud. She said it at the Sunday gathering in the schoolhouse, not to Anna, but near her, in that particular pitch of voice a certain kind of woman uses when she wants to be overheard without appearing to intend it. Grief takes people strangely, Cordelia said. Some drink. Some wander. Poor Anna is salting fish. The women near her laughed. Not cruelly. Only the small polite laugh of people who have agreed among themselves that a thing is settled. Anna heard it. She was standing by the stove pouring water into the coffee pot for the second time. She did not turn her head. She did not set the pot down hard. She poured the water carefully, the way she had been taught to pour it as a girl, and she took the pot back to the table, and she filled the cups of the 2 women nearest her, both of whom thanked her without meeting her eyes. That night she walked back the 3 miles to her farm in the long blue dusk, and she went into the shed and she checked the barrels she had already begun, and she noted in her small ledger the weight of salt she had used and the count of fish she had packed. She wrote in a hand very like her husband's, though she had not known she wrote that way until she was widowed, and had begun keeping the accounts alone. The second mocker was Reverend Halpern, and he came out to the farm on a Tuesday in June, riding a mule he did not sit well, wearing a coat too heavy for the weather because he believed his office required it. He was a good man in the way many ministers are good men, kind in the abstract, awkward in particular, sure of certain things because being unsure was a luxury his position did not afford him. He had known Mara Holland. He had spoken the words at the grave. He came out that Tuesday because he had heard about the fish, and because he believed it was his duty to speak with the widow before the whole county did the speaking for him. He sat in the kitchen, and he drank the coffee she poured for him, and he told her, gently, that a great many people in Bell Creek were concerned for her. That grief, he said, could take strange shapes. That a woman alone was vulnerable to the fixed idea, to the project that became a kind of speaking with the dead. That her husband, God rest him, would not have wanted her to spend her strength on a thing that could not sustain her through a hard winter. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was finished, she asked him if he would like more coffee. He said he would not. She thanked him for coming. She showed him to the door with the courtesy she had been raised to show any visitor, and she stood on the porch and watched him ride the mule back down the wagon track toward town, and she felt in her chest not anger but something quieter and more dangerous, the calm of a person who has understood, finally, that no one is going to help her, and that this, too, is a form of freedom. She went back inside, and she took down her husband's ledger, and she read the instruction again. Finished and filled with salted fish before the first hard frost. She read it 3 times. Then she went out to the shed, and she began to hang the door. The third mocker was a man called Wesley Pratt, who had been her husband's closest friend, and this was the hardest one. Wesley came out in July, when the alfalfa was standing high, and the days were long, and the light in the evenings had that particular western clarity that makes distant things look close enough to touch. He was baffled, was Wesley Pratt. He was not cruel, not condescending, not preacher solemn. He was only baffled, and his bafflement had an edge of grief in it because he had loved Merritt, and he could not understand why Merritt's widow was pouring this state into salt and dead fish. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and he told her that Merritt had never been right about anything practical in his life. He said not to wound her. He said it as a man saying an old truth about a friend he had loved anyway. He said that Merritt had chased 3 or 4 notions in his time, that the shed was one of the last of them, and that Anna, if she did not want to leave the country, ought at the very least to plant the ground that could be planted and let the shed be. He said her husband would not have blamed her for it. She stood in the yard with him, and she listened. She did not tell him that she had woken in night 3 times that week with the sense that her husband was standing at the foot of the bed, not as a ghost, but as a memory pressing forward, saying only the sentence he had written. She did not tell him that she had begun to feel, in the cool of the pit beneath the shed, something she could not name, a rightness of design, a purpose in the placement of the stones. She only thanked him for coming, and told him she meant to finish what she had begun. He nodded. He looked at her a long moment. He said, "He was my friend, Anna. I would not want you to spend yourself on nothing." She said, "I know." He rode away. That was the cruelest of the 3, because it was the truest. Reverend Halpern spoke from office. Cordelia Enderby spoke from the small pleasure a certain kind of woman takes in the falling of another. Wesley Pratt spoke from love, and love badly reasoned is harder to bear than any other kind of speech. She went into the shed, and she worked until dark. Through July and into August she worked. She made 3 more trips to the forks of the Belle Fourche, and once further, up to a cold creek in the Bighorn foothills that a Shoshone trader had told her about in exchange for a bolt of blue cloth. She learned to gut and clean a fish in less time than it took her to churn a pound of butter. She learned which salts held the fish best. The coarse gray salt from Enderby's cost half what the fine white cost, and she found by trial that the coarse held better, drew the water out cleaner, kept the flesh firm through the long weeks. She learned the smell of fish curing rightly and the smell of fish curing wrongly, and she learned to trust her nose above her eyes because her nose knew things 2 days before her eyes did. She worked from the notes. The single-folded page her husband had left her held more than she had first seen. She had thought at first that it was only the one instruction and the crooked shape below it. But as she sat with it in the evenings by the yellow light of the kerosene lamp, she began to see that the page was not 1 page, but 2 pages pressed together. The paper had been folded so long that it had stuck to itself along the crease. She worked it apart with a butter knife and a slow patience, and beneath the top layer she found more writing. Not much. A few lines. But the lines were enough to keep her working. The lines described, in her husband's shorthand, the layering of the pit. Stone first, then a course of sand 3 fingers deep, then a layer of clean straw, tramped tight, then the barrels. Between the barrels, more straw. Above the barrels, boards laid loose, not nailed, so a person could shift them. Above the boards, a second packing of straw, and above the straw, the plank floor of the shed itself. The whole system was a kind of quiet insulation, a matter of dead air held in layers, of stone below to hold the ground's steady coolness, of straw above to hold the winter's cold from reaching down. She did not, at first, understand why it needed to be so elaborate for potatoes. Then she read the last words on the second page, and she saw that the shed was not built for potatoes. It was built for fish. And the fish, once salted and packed, needed to be kept at a particular kind of temperature, not frozen, not warm, through a winter that might last 5 months, in a country where the outside temperature at night could reach 40 below, and the outside temperature at noon in January could still be 20 below. The pit, she understood, was to be a kind of long, slow cellar that would use the earth's own steadiness to hold the barrels at the temperature the fish needed. Not the temperature of the air above. Not the temperature of the snow. The temperature of the ground 8 feet down, where the frost never reached, where the earth in July was the same as the earth in January. And around the barrels, the layers of straw and board would trap the cold from above and hold the ground warmth in, hold the fish steady week by week, month by month, through whatever the sky above was doing. She had never heard of such a thing. She did not know where her husband had learned it. She suspected from a phrase in the notes that he had learned it from a man he had known in Minnesota years before their marriage, a Norwegian fisherman who had come inland and taught himself to keep salt cod through the prairie winters by the same method. There was a name in the margin, half smudged, that might have been Olson or Olofsson. She would never know. It did not matter. She had the method. She had the notes. She had the summer. She finished the packing in the last week of September. She counted her barrels, 9 in the end, 7 of fish and 2 of salt in reserve, and she pressed the boards down over them, and she packed the straw above, and she closed the shed door, and she stood in the yard in the cold blue evening, and she felt something she had not felt since the March morning her husband had died. She felt, for a moment, the weight of him beside her, not as a ghost, only as a man who had left a piece of himself in the work, and who was, in some small way, still working through her hands. The first frost came on the 3rd of October. A hard one. The ground crackled at dawn. She stood on the porch with her coffee, and she watched the light come up over the pale country, and she thought of the Reverend and Cordelia Enderby and Wesley Pratt, and she thought of the fish sleeping in their salt beneath the plank floor of the shed. She did not smile. She was not a smiling woman. She only nodded once to herself, and she went inside. October passed. November came down out of the north, with the sound of a door closing. The first storm of any real size struck in the second week of November. It came in the afternoon, and it did not come the way storms usually came, from the west, in one long, approaching gray. It came from the north in a wall, and it was on the town in 20 minutes. She was outside when it came. She had time to get the 2 cows into the barn, and the 6 hens under the porch, and the door to the shed checked and latched, and then she was inside her own kitchen with the wind sounding on the north wall, like a hand pressing steadily against it. She stood at the window, and she watched the world go white. She thought of the note. She thought of the sentence that had said the cellar must be finished and filled before the first hard frost. She had done that. She had made the deadline. The rest, whether the layering was right, whether the depth was right, whether the fish would hold, she would learn in time. The storm lasted 2 days. When it broke, she went out into a country changed. The snow was to her waist in the yard, and to her chest in the drifts against the barn. The wagon track to town was invisible, and would be invisible, she understood, until March. She dug her way to the barn, and she milked the cows, and she gathered the eggs, and she came back inside, and she boiled water, and she made tea, and she sat by the stove, and she thought about who in Bell Creek had made ready for such a winter, and who had not. The second storm came a week later. The third came a week after that. By the middle of December the county was sealed. No wagons moved. The mail did not come. The train that ran the northern route had stopped altogether. The drifts on the passes were too deep, and the crews sent out to break them through had lost 2 men and turned back. She heard these things from a boy called Toller, who came to her door in the last week of December, sent by his mother, because the boy was small and light, and could go over the drifts on snowshoes. He stood in her kitchen, and he ate the bread she gave him, and he told her that Enderby's store was down to flour and coffee and not much else. that the McCullough family had lost their milk cow to the cold, that the Reverend was sick with the pleurisy, that his own father, Wesley Pratt, was rationing hay. She did not react to the last piece of news. She only asked the boy if he would like more bread. He said he would. She cut him another slice. When he left, she stood at the window and watched him go, small and dark against the white, moving over the drifts on his snowshoes like a creature made for the country. And she went out to the shed, and she opened the door, and she went down into the pit, and she lit the lantern, and she looked at her barrels. They were cold. They were not frozen. She pried up a board, and she lifted the top layer of straw, and she put her hand on the side of the nearest barrel, and she felt the wood cool beneath her palm, and the salt brine steady inside. She opened the barrel, and she took out one fish, and she held it to the lantern light. It was firm. It was pale. It was as it should be. She stood in the pit for a long time. She thought of the notes. She thought of the crooked shape at the bottom of the page. She understood, now, that it had been a rough drawing of a fish. She thought of her husband, who had never explained anything, who had only made things and trusted that if he made them well, they would speak for themselves. She had done what she understood the notes to say. She hoped it was what he had meant. She had no way to ask. She closed the barrel. She replaced the straw. She fitted the board back into place. She climbed out of the pit, and she closed the shed door, and she latched it, and she went back into the house, and she began to think about how much fish, in a hard winter, one widow could reasonably feed to a town that had not asked her to save it. The knock came on the 6th of January. She had known it would come. She had heard 3 days before that the McCulloughs had begun to slaughter their remaining calf, and she had understood what that meant. She had heard 2 days before that Cordelia Enderby had been seen at the well weeping. She had understood what that meant, too. She had waited. She had not gone into town. She had done nothing to make it easier for anyone to ask her. She opened the door. Wesley Pratt stood on the porch. He had lost weight. His coat hung looser on him than she remembered. His face had the color of a man who has been eating too little for too long, and his eyes had the look of a man who has come to say a thing he does not know how to say. He said, "Anna." She said, "Come in." He came in. She poured him coffee. He sat at the table, and he held the cup with both hands, and after a long moment he said, "The town is in a bad way." She said, "I know." He said, "I would not have come if there were another door to knock on." She said, "I know that too." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said, "They are saying, some of them are saying that you have fish, that you have a great deal of it, that you have been keeping it in that shed of Merritt's." She said, "I have." He looked at her. She saw in his face the moment when he understood, not fully but enough, what she had done. She saw him remember his own words in the yard in July. She saw him swallow them. He was a decent man. It cost him to sit at her table and ask. He said, "The Enderbys have 2 small children. The McCulloughs have 4. The Reverend is dying, I think. I would ask. I do not know how to ask." She said, "You do not have to ask, Wesley." She stood up. She went to the shelf above the stove, and she took down the tin box. She opened it. She took out the folded page of her husband's notes. She unfolded it. She laid it on the table between them, so that he could see the sentence at the top, and the crooked drawing at the bottom, and the second page beneath, with its careful lines of instruction. She said, "He wrote this the winter before he died. He knew this was coming. I do not know how he knew. He knew." Wesley Pratt looked at the page for a long time. He did not touch it. When he looked up at her, his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it, and she was grateful to him for not trying. He said, "How much do you have?" She said, 9 barrels, 7 of fish, 2 of salt. Enough, I think, if it is portioned. Enough, at least, for the children. He said, "Anna, I do not have words." She said, "Then do not use any. Go and tell them. Tell them to send who can walk. Tell them I will not ration by name. I will ration by household, by count. Tell them to bring their own vessels. Tell them the fish is salted heavy and must be soaked before eating. Tell them not to thank me. I did not do it for thanks." He nodded. He stood up. He went to the door. He turned at the door, and he looked at her, and she saw in his face the whole shape of what he understood, that he had been wrong in July, that his friend had not been wrong in life, that a woman he had pitied had been carrying, all along, the thing that would save the children of the people who had pitied her. He did not say it. He only nodded once the way a man nods when he has taken a thing on and means to carry it. He went out into the snow. They came that afternoon. They came the next day. They came for 3 weeks, in 2s and 3s, over the drifts on whatever they could travel on. She met each of them at the door. She did not let them into the shed. She went down herself and brought up the fish, and she portioned it on the kitchen table by the count her husband's notes had suggested. 1.5 pounds per adult per week, 3/4 pound per child, adjusted for the size of the household. She did not smile. She did not scold. She did not, at any point, refer to what any of them had said in the summer. Cordelia Enderby came on the second day. She stood in the doorway, and she did not meet Anna's eyes, and when Anna handed her the packet wrapped in oiled paper, Cordelia said, quietly, "Anna." "Aye." Anna said, "Soak it 2 hours in cold water before you cook it. Change the water once. It will be salty even then, but it will feed them." Cordelia looked up. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She nodded. She went out. That was all that was ever said between them about the summer. It was enough. It had to be enough. The Reverend did not die. His fever broke in the 4th week of January, and by the time he was well enough to ride out to the farm, the worst of the passage was over, though the snow still stood deep in every hollow of the country. He came in the 2nd week of February on the mule, wearing the same too-heavy coat. He sat in her kitchen. He drank her coffee. He did not preach at her. He asked her only how she had known. She said, "I did not know." He knew. The Reverend was quiet a long time. Then he said, "I spoke poorly in June. I did not understand." She said, "You spoke as you thought you ought. I have not held it against you." He looked at her, and he seemed about to say something more, and then he did not. He drank his coffee. He rode away. Wesley Pratt came again in late February. He brought her a haunch of venison from an elk he had shot in the river bottoms. He would not accept anything for it. He stood in her yard, and he said, "Anna, in the summer, I said your husband had never been right about anything. I want you to know I have thought about that sentence every day since Christmas." She said, "Wesley." He said, "I will think about it for the rest of my life." She said, "Do not do that. He would not want it. Think about something useful instead." He almost smiled. He did not quite. He mounted his horse, and he rode away, and she stood in the yard in the pale February light, and she watched him go, and she felt, for the first time since March of the year before, something that was not quite grief and was not quite gladness, but partook of both. The snow began to soften in the 3rd week of March. The wagon track opened at the end of the month. By the middle of April the country was itself again, brown and wet and beginning, in the low places, to green. She went into the shed. She counted what remained. 1 barrel of fish, half full. 1 barrel of salt, unopened. Enough, if she was careful, to see her through until she could travel again to the forks of the Belle Fourche. She sat on the edge of the pit, and she took out the folded page of her husband's notes. She had carried it with her that winter everywhere she went, in her apron pocket, folded small. She unfolded it now, in the April light coming down through the doorway of the shed. She looked at the sentence at the top. She looked at the 2nd page, with its careful lines. She looked at the crooked drawing at the bottom. She noticed then, for the first time, that there was writing on the back of the 2nd page. She had never turned it over. She had never thought to. The page had been so brittle at the crease that she had been afraid to handle it more than she had to. She turned it, carefully, in the April light. On the back, in her husband's hand, unsteady but legible, were 3 lines. The first line said, "If you are reading this, the shed is finished. I am sorry I could not finish it with you." The second line said, "The method is not mine. It came from a man in Minnesota. He said the winter of '86 would be the hardest in 50 years. I believed him. I hope I was right too." The third line said, "Do not keep the fish for yourself. That was never the reason." She sat in the doorway of the shed for a long time. She did not weep. She had done her weeping already, more than once in the barn and in the yard and in the kitchen at 3 in the morning by the yellow lamp. She only sat, and she read the 3 lines again, and she folded the page along its old creases, and she put it back into her apron pocket. She thought of the winter of '86. She thought of the children in the Enderby house, and the McCullough house, and the Pratt house, who would be children now for another summer because of a sentence a Norwegian fisherman had spoken to her husband years before either of them had ever heard the name Bell Creek. She thought of her husband, who had believed a stranger, and who had built a shed for a winter he did not live to see, and who had left her a page of notes that had said everything he could think to say, and had trusted her to find the rest. She stood up. She closed the shed door. She latched it. She walked back to the house in the April light, and she went inside, and she put the folded page in the tin box on the shelf above the stove, and she closed the lid, and she did not open it again for a long time. She did not tell anyone about the 3 lines on the back of the second page. Not Wesley Pratt, who came often through the summer of '87, and who was, in his slow, careful way, becoming a friend to her again. Not Cordelia Enderby, who came once in June, and sat in the kitchen, and cried a little, and did not try to explain herself, and was not asked to. Not the Reverend, who came in July, and preached a sermon at the schoolhouse that used the word preparation 7 times, and did not name her once, which was the kindest thing he could have done, and the thing she was most grateful for. She kept the 3 lines to herself. They were not for the town. They were for her, and for a man in Minnesota she had never met, and for a husband who had died in a March thaw, with an instruction on his lips he had not lived long enough to explain. A father cannot give his son every answer. A husband, dying, cannot give his wife every reason. The best ones leave behind enough questions to build a life on. If this story stayed with you, another is already waiting when you are ready to hear it.